Are we good? All right. Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Apologies for the delay and the few technical issues. We'll try to get them resolved. I know we haven't had our Kahoot in a while, or the slides. Inshallah, we'll try to see if the mosque can help us with that. We are at a very, very important stage in the Seerah. We've come through from when we started, where the Prophet ﷺ got the revelation, and it was just Khadija and Ali pretty much believing, to a state where the Muslims in Medina have established themselves as a financial and political superpower. But what's going to happen now is that they establish themselves as a military superpower as well. But Badr is more important than just its military might. Badr is important because in the Battle of Badr, several very undeniable miracles happen. And we'll cover them in a second. Now, where we left off was that I think that's a bit too loud. Where we left off was that the Muslims have now camped right in front of the wells of Badr, and the Quraysh, who are coming from the south, are camping on the opposite side. They're literally facing each other. And in the night, we saw from the verse of the Quran that there was a gentle rain that put the Muslims to sleep. However, the Quraysh, the Meccans, had a very restless sleep. Now it is morning, and the Quraysh are really not in it. They don't want to fight. Their heart's not in it. But Abu Jahl, being Abu Jahl, starts to coerce them, starts to say, what's wrong with you? You need to fight. This is our chance. We'll destroy them once and for all. And Abu Jahl gets up and he makes this dua. Is that too loud? Kind of feel like, no. Abu Jahl gets up and makes this strange dua, fake dua. He says, "O Lord, whichever of the two parties was less kind to his relatives and brought us what we do not know, then destroy them tomorrow." Funny. That's hypocrisy to the max. And the reason he's saying this is because all around him, the Quraysh are saying, those are our relatives. Those are our brothers and sisters and sons and fathers. We don't want to fight them. We came here to protect the caravan. That's done. Let's go back. So Abu Jahl turns it on them and says, well, they're the ones who destroyed our relatives. They're the ones who destroyed our kingship. So I'm going to make this dua that they get destroyed. In response, Surah Al-Anfal comes down and it says this. All you faithless Meccans, if you ever look for a definitive resolution in your struggles with the believers, then there you have it. The resolution has come to you. So if you would just stop opposing Allah, it would be better for you. If you ever return to fight against the believers, then we'll bring about the same result. The forces under your command are of no use to you, no matter how numerous they become. For God is with the believers, and He helps them to achieve victory. This was a revelation that came in response to Abu Jahl's fake prayer. At this time, in the Meccan camp, there was Abdullah ibn Suhail. He was a Sahaba who was captured by his family, and he was forced to fight against the Muslims. So he was brought into the army. But when no one was looking, he escapes and manages to get to the Muslim camp. Now the Muslims are all arrayed in ranks and files, and the Prophet ﷺ starts to inspect them. So he goes before them, and he's carrying with him an arrow, and he uses the arrow to straighten the lines. He gets to one of the Sahaba by the name of Saud ibn Ghaziyah, and he very gently pokes Saud in the stomach. And Saud goes, "Oh, that hurt, that you just stabbed me," to the Prophet. And he says, I demand justice for this. So the Prophet lifts his shirt and he says, "Here's the arrow, you can stab me back." And Saud instead kisses his stomach and he says, "Oh Prophet, if this is the last time I'm going to be alive, the last thing I do, which I want to be, is that my skin touches your skin." I say this because it gives you an example of the love that the Sahaba has for the Prophet. They're willing to die. They're going to die. Most of them have accepted. Remember the numbers? 300 Muslims versus 1,000 Meccans. 3 to 1. They've pretty much accepted that their fate is martyrdom. But what they're concerned is to show the love to the Prophet, even if that's the last thing they do. Now the Prophet ﷺ does not want this battle to happen either. he tries to avoid it at all costs. So what he does is he sends Omar ibn Khattab to the Quraysh to tell them, look, you go back your way, we'll go back ours. This doesn't have to happen. But obviously Abu Jahl and the rest refused that. It's interesting, do you guys know Karen Armstrong? Karen Armstrong, yeah, so she has a very interesting commentary, if I can find it. And this commentary is about her observation of how Muslims behave in conflict, and I'll read it to you. Constantly, the Quran insists upon the importance of mercy and forgiveness, even during armed conflict. While engaged in hostilities, Muslims must fight with courage and steadfastness in order to bring the conflict to an end as quickly as possible. But the moment the enemy asks for peace, Muslims must lay down their arms. They must accept any offer of truce, whatever the conditions are imposed, even if they suspect the enemy are double-dealing. And although it's important to fight persecution and oppression, the Quran constantly reminds all Muslims that it is much better to sit down and solve the problem by courteous discussion. And the Prophet ﷺ was trying to do this. Even to the very last minute, he sent Omar to negotiate and asked him to stop. So this concept that Islam was spread by the sword is really not true. Really not true. And there's plenty of evidences much after as well of where Muslim armies tried to avoid bloodshed at all costs. Now the day of battle arrives. It's a Friday during the month of Ramadan. So the Muslims are fasting. And the Prophet turns to Abu Bakr, who is standing beside him, and suddenly says out of nowhere, "Be of good cheer, Abu Bakr, the help of Allah has come." And he points and he says, "Here is Jibril, and his hand is on the rein of a horse which he is leading, and he is armed for war." Now Abu Bakr can't see this, but he finds this very strange that the Prophet ﷺ suddenly says this to him. This is important because this is a precursor, or it is an indication of what is going to happen at the battle. Now the battle starts. The Arab custom whenever the battles happen is that there's always a one-on-one duel. When you say one-on-one, usually it's about 3 people come forward and 3 people come from the other team and they duel each other. It's to kind of try to demoralize the other team and moralize your own side. The Quraysh send out Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, his brother Shaiba, and his son Walid. Soon as they step forward, 3 Ansars come running forward to face them, right? Without the Prophet's permission, they come running, and the Quraysh just laugh at them. They say pretty much, "Who are you? You're not notables. We don't know who you are. You're not Quraysh. You're not noble like us. Get back. We're not fighting you." So they're sent back, and the Prophet ﷺ then chooses his cousin Ubayd ibn Harith, his uncle Hamza, and of course Ali. And he chooses them, one, because the Quraysh can't disregard them because they're his very own family, and 2, he is careful to choose to match the ages of each of the opponents because he doesn't want to be unfair. He doesn't want an elderly person fighting someone very young. Even in this, even in battle, the Prophet ﷺ tries to make it fair. Hamza faces Shaiba, Ali faces Walid, and Ubayd faces Utbah. So based on their ages, they separate off. Hamza, obviously, like I said, Hamza is a giant. He's a mountain. He pretty much slays his opponent straight away. Ali, likewise, is very skilled, and he manages to slay his opponent. However, Ubayd is more older. He's elderly, and he's in an intense battle with Utbah. They're both clashing swords, and it's going backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. And Utbah manages to strike Ubayd, and he is injured. When he's injured, Hamza and Ali come to his aid, and they fight Utbah together, and Utbah is also slain. They manage to carry Ubayd back to the camp, and unfortunately, Ubayd passes away from his injuries. So he is technically one of the first martyrs of Badr. And we're not sure if he actually dies before everyone else or if he dies later. And the reason is that most Seerah books have a different Sahaba as the first martyr of Badr, and we'll get to that in a second. So he might have actually still been alive when the battle commences. Now, Utbah is the father of Hind. There's a reason I'm telling you this. Remember that Utbah is the father of Hind. And this is what sparks Hind's hatred towards Hamza, the death of Utbah. And we'll come to that when we cover Uhud. Now, Ubayd, remember the one who got injured? When he passes away, Ubayd's wife is a lady by the name of Zainab bint Khuzaimah, who later marries the Prophet ﷺ. Okay. So now, the duel has gone in the favor of the Muslims. The morale of the Muslims are up, and the Quraysh were already demoralized, have now even further plummeted. But what they do is, in retaliation, they start shooting showers of arrows towards the Muslims. And the first to strike was a young Khazraj Ansar by the name of Harith ibn Suraka. Now, Harith ibn Suraka was actually not fighting. None of them were fighting at this stage. The two armies were still separate when the arrows were shot. Harith was actually taking water out of the well, and the arrow hits him and he dies instantly. When Harith's mother finds out, she's very troubled, because Harith's mother is thinking he's not a martyr because he wasn't fighting. And she's very upset about it. And when the Prophet ﷺ hears of it, he actually goes to the mother and says, no, he is a martyr. Even though he wasn't fighting, he was still in battle and he is still considered a martyr. The Prophet ﷺ sees Harith fall. And he gets up. And this is one of the rare occasions where the Prophet ﷺ actually raises his voice. You don't really hear it a lot. Do you remember another occasion where it happened? Where did the Prophet actually raise his voice? I mean, up till this point. Anyone remember? When Omar becomes Muslim, remember he gave such a loud Allahu Akbar that everyone heard it. Few occasions. This is another one. When he sees this young boy Harith shot by an arrow, he stands up and he says, Ya Mansur Amit, which means, O you who God has already made victorious, slay. That's pretty hard stuff, because the Prophet's not like that. He doesn't say slay, but in this instance, you see the intensity of the situation. 300 versus 1,000, and despite that, they've already shot and killed an innocent boy with an arrow, and the Prophet, I assume, is quite angry. And he says, oh, you who Allah has already given victorious, slay. And that becomes the battle cry for Badr. You'll see as we cover battles that each battle usually has a different battle cry. The battle cry for Badr is Ya Mansur Amit. And then the Prophet ﷺ stoops down, takes some pebbles, and he throws it towards the Quraysh. Again, a rare instance where we see the strength of the Prophet ﷺ as a warrior. Usually we see him as a very gentle, very quiet, very peaceful. But in this, he comes out as a real warrior. Once that has happened, that is it. There is no turning back. The two armies charge towards each other, and they collide. They smash into each other pretty much, and it is now hand-to-hand combat. What's interesting, how many kids are here? There's a reason I see this. Certain instances in the Battle of Badr become incredibly graphic, and I am wondering if I should cover that or not. To give you an idea, I'm saying this because to give you an idea, it's not like the battles we're used to in modern day where you can kill thousands with a single bomb and it's, gunshot and people. This is, back then, we are talking about swords, metal instruments, stabbing and slashing and chopping. It is incredibly gruesome. And so to kind of give you a picture of what Badr was happening, that was what it was. Everyone was slashing at each other. It really was. As this is happening, the Prophet ﷺ stands up and they say that he had his arms stretched out and you could hear him saying, "O Allah, should these Muslims be defeated," pointing to the people who are now in the thick of battle, "should these Muslims be defeated today, there will be no one to worship you here." So he's saying, "Oh Allah, this is a turning point." And we have to remember that it couldn't have happened because it was never decreed for it to happen. But if Badr had been different, we would not be here. Our our kids would not be here. Everything would have changed if it wasn't for those 300 Muslims. And this is why scholars say that amongst the Sahaba are the best of people, but from the Sahaba, the best of the Sahaba were the 300 of the Badr. And from the 300 of the Badr, the best of people were the 10 promised Jannah. And you will see that this is really, really an intense and important point in our history. In response, Surah Al-Anfal verses 9, 12 and 17 is revealed. And it goes like this. Remember how you fervently asked for the help of your Lord at the battle of Badr? He answered you, saying, I will help you with a regiment of 1,000 angels. Remember also that your Lord inspired the angels to a message of hope to your hearts that said, I am with you. So steady the believers. I'm going to put terror in the hearts of the faithless. So strike at their necks with your weapons and lop off their fingertips. It wasn't you who struck them at the battle of Badr, it was Allah. When you threw a symbolic handful of pebbles at the idol worshippers as the battle commenced, it wasn't something you did, but Allah who did it. So He could test the believers with fine tests from Himself. For God hears and knows things. These verses of the Quran are important because it actually outlines specific things that happen at Badr. Now, like I said, there are miracles that happen at Badr. There is the natural, what you see, the physical, the 300 versus the 1,000, the fighting, the slashing, the cutting. But Badr was something that the supernatural happened so very clearly. And I wondered, there have been many battles after, right? Why didn't the same happen? Uhud, for example. Why didn't the same happen? I'll ask you this question again after we cover the miracles, and we'll have a bit of a think about that. So let's start with one of the first miracles. A Sahaba by the name of Ukasha was in the thick of battle, and he was striking left, right, and center, and he was striking so hard and so fast that his sword actually snapped and broke. He manages to fight his way out of the crowd and gets back to the Prophet, and in his mind he's thinking, if I get to the Prophet ﷺ, I can ask for another sword, and that will be a blessed sword because it's from the hands of the Prophet. So he gets to the Prophet ﷺ, you can imagine him sweaty and bloodied and dirty, and he asks the Prophet, give me a sword, Ya Rasulullah. The Prophet gives him a blunted piece of stick and says, fight with this. He doesn't question. He takes it and he charges straight back into the battle. But what is miraculous, and this is really strange, but there is evidence for this, is that as he's swinging his sword, he realizes what he has in his hand, the stick, what he has in his hand is actually a sword. Somehow, there is a sword in his hand where it used to be a stick. This particular sword, the Sahaba all saw, and was so inspiring that they actually named it Al-Awan, the divine help. And it was with them for a while. I don't know where it is. If I had to make a guess, I'd probably say at Topkapi Museum in Turkey, if it's there, but I don't know where that sword's gone now. But for a long time, the Sahaba would call it Al-Awan. The other big thing, remember the verse of the Quran that we sent you a regiment of 1,000 angels? This actually happened. And it's because there are eyewitness accounts of very strange occurrences happening at Badr. One such eyewitness account actually comes from non-Muslim. There were two Arab Bedouins who were near the area of Badr, and they knew that a battle was happening. So what they decided was, they said, we'll go and spy out the battle, and when the battle's finished, we can run in and get all the loot. So they wanted to pretty much steal off the dead bodies. So they climbed up a mountain, and they were watching the battle happen, and then suddenly they feel this shadow over them. And they look up, and it's a massive cloud. And the massive cloud floats over them and heads towards the battle. But they hear amongst the cloud the sound of neighing horses, a multitude of horses and of armor, of metal, and of voices inside the cloud. One of the Bedouin tribes are so scared that he actually dies from the heart attack. He has a heart attack on the spot and he dies. The other Bedouin manages to later tell the Prophet what he heard and what the sound was. Okay, so we can say, all right, that was just one witness, right? But this particular instance, after the cloud descends, there were certain things that happened that many Sahaba saw. A couple of things. When the battle is happening and some of the Quraysh was retreating and they were running, the Muslims would chase after them. And as they were chasing after them, they saw that the person they were chasing would suddenly drop dead, or their head would literally go off their shoulders, and yet no one's there. And this happened many occasions. They say that when the battle finished, the Muslims were actually able to divide the bodies of the enemies to those killed by humans and those killed by the angels, because the ones killed by the angels, the wounds were cauterized. They were heated, the wounds, whereas the ones killed by the humans were not. The other thing is, do you remember how many horses the Meccans had? Remember I said last week. How many horses did the Meccans have at the start of the battle? 2. They had 2 horses. That's all they had. They had the Muslims. Did I say Meccans? Sorry. I meant the Muslims. How many did the Muslims have? They had 2. But suddenly the Sahaba are seeing all these people on horses riding around fighting the Quraysh. And there's a lot of them. And they notice that they actually look different. All of these people on horses are having white gleaming turbans, except for one. One has a bright yellow turban, and later, I don't know if the Prophet says it, but the book narrates that that particular person was considered to be Jibril, leading the charge of the other angels. Other Sahaba have witnessed that the feet of the horses were not touching the ground. They were a few centimeters off the ground, and they were literally gliding. These were witnessed by many Sahaba, many Muslims. The other thing that happened was what the Quran revealed. So I said there was 1,000 Meccans, 50, they say 50 to 70, but let's say 50. 50 were killed, 50 were captured, right? Some narrations say 70 were killed, 70 were captured. Let's say 50, so that's 100. So 900 Meccans ran in fear against 300 Muslims. They literally ran away. And we know why, because it wasn't the fear of the Muslims they ran from, it was the fear that the presence of the angels brought to them. And there is also, I'll get to a second, I'm kind of going to jump ahead, but there's actually an area when the Battle of Badr was happening that the Sahaba said that the angels didn't go towards. And in that area, there was a group of Meccans who continued to fight and didn't seem to be affected by the fear that the rest of the Meccans were fearing. The polar opposite happened to the Muslims. The presence of the angels caused them to fight with such ferocity that they actually didn't feel fear or pain or tiredness. And there is a perfect example of this. This is what I mean by getting graphic. Who was it? Yes. So there was an area, like I said, where the Meccans were fighting, that they weren't affected by the fear. And in that group of Meccans who continued to fight this, while all the 900 were running away, was Abu Jahl. So a Sahaba by the name of Muad sees Abu Jahl, and he goes to fight Abu Jahl. He manages to knock Abu Jahl onto the floor, but Ikram, Abu Jahl's son, then comes from behind him and slashes into his shoulder. He slashes so hard, so excuse again the graphic, slashes so hard that it literally takes the shoulder off and his arm is hanging by a small piece of skin. But Muad doesn't even sense it. He switches sword hands and he continues fighting with his good sword. When the cut limb, it starts to get in his way, he bends over, puts the limb on the ground, puts his foot on his limb, and then tugs up, literally ripping his arm off himself, and continues to fight. I don't know whether he passed away. I assume he did. I don't know. The book doesn't say. But it says that he continued to fight and he continued to chase the Quraysh off the battlefield with one arm and the other arm pretty much on the floor. This is just an example. But the battle that happened at Badr, like I said, was very unique. It has never happened before and it has never happened since. So the question back as to, in this particular battle, there were literally angels fighting that chased away 1,000 army. Why did that not happen in later battles, in Uhud and many others that the Prophet ﷺ was partaking in? Why only Badr? I don't have the answer to this, by the way. I don't know. It's a question I have. My theory, and this might be wrong, my theory is that for the Muhajirun who came from Mecca, they had seen many, many miracles already. Major one, the splitting of the moon. But the Ansar hadn't really witnessed this yet. This was a miracle that solidified the Ansar. It was kind of like the Muhajirun had a gift from Allah with these miracles. It was time for the Ansar to have a gift from Allah as well. And thereafter, it didn't happen again. So, when the battle finishes and the dust settles, 900 Meccans are running in fear, literally dropping their armor and everything they brought with them. 50 to 70 Meccans are captured. 50 to 70 Meccans are dead. 14 Muslims have been killed and none have been captured. That's even modern warfare standards, that is insane, absolutely insane. Sad thing though is amongst the 14 Meccans, the Muslims who died was Umair ibn Waqas. Does anyone know who Umair ibn Waqas is? Sorry, Umair ibn Abi Waqas. Anyone know who that is? He, brother of Saad, he was 15 years old. He was someone who the Prophet ﷺ refused and said, no, you're too young, you can't come. And he begged and begged and begged the Prophet to come. And the Prophet ﷺ allowed, he was amongst the dead, which was quite heartbreaking for the Prophet ﷺ as well and all the Sahaba to see. Now the Muslims had a big issue. They had captured 70 Meccans and they didn't know what to do with them. They weren't prepared to have prisoners. The other big problem here was that there were 900 Meccans still out there. And if they regrouped and came back to attack the Muslims, the 70 Meccans who were there could rise up against the Muslims and attack them from behind. This was a serious problem. The Muslims didn't know what to do. They didn't even have enough food to feed this extra 70 people now. So the question was going backwards and forwards, what do we do? And actually the situation was still quite intense because the Prophet ﷺ kind of took the camp back and retreated a bit back, and people, the Sahaba were standing guard because they couldn't believe that the 900 would just run away. They were actually expecting them to regroup and attack again. And if they attacked again, 900 versus now what, 285. Still heavily outnumbered. So the Muslims were still quite worried. And to make that even more complex, what do you do with these 70 prisoners now? Omar and Saad ibn Muad were saying, we have to kill them. We can't keep them, we have to kill them. We don't have enough food, we can't look after them and they will attack us. Abu Bakr and the Prophet ﷺ said, we can't kill them. They are our prisoners, they are in our custody. And the Prophet ﷺ said, we can ransom them, we'll ransom them. Later, Omar leaves the camp and he comes back and he finds Abu Bakr and Omar weeping, literally weeping. And Omar says, what happened? And Surah Al-Anfal 67 and 70 is revealed. And it goes like this. It is not right for a prophet to start taking prisoners of war wholesale in order to collect ransoms, when he hasn't even subdued the land. You believers want the temporary good of this lower world, while Allah wants to give you rewards of the next life. And Allah is powerful and wise. How many reprimands has the Prophet had since we started the Seerah so far? This would be the third one. The first one is of the Prophet ﷺ looking away when the blind Sahaba came. The second was when, the first one was when he was making dua for Abu Talib, and he says it's not right. And then the second one was when he looked away, and this is the third one. And you can understand why he was crying. It's very interesting, the Prophet, when verse from the Quran comes to reprimand the Prophet, there's no mincing of words. It's not diluted because it's the Prophet. The same strength is given to him as it would to any other Muslim. And this was so hard that they were crying. But verse 70 then comes down and says, nevertheless, now that the Prophet has given an instruction, stick to it. You can understand how challenging the situation is for the Prophet, right? He is not only trying to help keep this community together, fight battles, be a father, look after his children, have all these wives, have all these problems, have the hypocrites attacking, have the Quraysh attacking, but he also has a pretty strict boss, which is Allah. And he's getting reprimanded as well. So when I read that, I was thinking the challenge he must be under. And these verses come down and boom, he breaks down crying. He's superhuman, yeah, to be dealing with juggling all these things. After the battle, the Muslims go on to the battlefield and they collect the bodies of the slain Muslims. And like I said, they were separating the bodies of the Meccans, and they were making two piles, one killed by the angels, one killed by humans. But they come across, a Sahaba by the name of Abdullah Bin Masood comes across, guess who? Still alive, Abu Jahl. He's still alive and he's still there. Anyone know who Abdullah Bin Masood is? Correct. Abdullah Bin Masood was a very, very poor Muslim. He was a very poor Muslim, and he was a shepherd, and he came from a very, very poor tribe as well. So Abu Jahl used to make fun of him all the time and abuse him and torture him. So, it's a miracle, another miracle that it is this particular Sahaba who finds Abu Jahl there. And Abu Jahl, yet in his arrogance, looks at him and says, "O little shepherd, how high you have raised yourself." Abdullah Bin Masood doesn't say anything. He takes the sword and in one swift move ends Abu Jahl. And that is the end of one of the biggest enemies of the Prophet ﷺ in the battle in the field of Badr. Now, Abdullah ibn Masood, just a side note, Abdullah ibn Masood later becomes one of the greatest scholars of Islam. He later moves to Iraq, and the Hanafi madhab, a lot of the rulings of the Hanafi madhab are based on Abdullah ibn Masood's rulings and teachings. Just to give you an idea. Abu Jahl wasn't actually wrong. He started off as this poor shepherd, and he became one of the sources of numerically the biggest madhab that Islam has.
Did it mention about him cutting Abu Jahl's head?
It said that he slew him with one. He didn't say anything, he just took the sword and ended him.
Because he's the one who slapped this Mansur guy once. And then they say that when he cut the head off, Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam asked him, the slap before and this one is like
Equal. Balances.
because when he was slapped, my understanding was the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam smiled when he came to complain. Smiled at him. It's like, I think Allah showed him that he's not perfect.
So there's an interesting paragraph. I'm aware of the time, but I'll read it really quickly. There's a paragraph in the book about the controversial verse, "Slay them where you find them." This is something that people who hate Muslims use a lot. Slay them where they find them. So this paragraph that he talks about, it says, "It is true that some verses in the Quran instruct the Prophet ﷺ and his followers to slay the polytheists wherever you confront them, to carry the struggle to the hypocrites who deny the faith, and especially to fight those who do not believe in Allah in the last days. However, it must be understood that these verses were directly, specifically at the Quraysh and their clandestine partisans in Yathrib, specifically named in the Quran as the polytheists and the hypocrites, respectively, with whom the Ummah was locked in a terrible war. Nevertheless, these verses have long been used by Muslims and non-Muslims alike to suggest that Islam advocates fighting unbelievers until they convert. But this is not the view that either the Quran or the Prophet ﷺ endorsed. This view was put forth during the height of the Crusades and partly in response to them by later generations of Islamic legal scholars who developed what is now referred to as the classical doctrine of Jihad. Ibn Taymiyyah argues that the idea of killing non-believers who refuse to convert to Islam, the foundation of the classical doctrine of Jihad, not only defied the example of the Prophet ﷺ, but also violated one of the most important principles in the Quran, that there can be no compulsion in religion. So you have to understand, how do you balance these two things? You have to balance it by people like scholars who understand that which verse was specific to that instance and which verse was more general. In this instance, it was in relation to the battle, the warfare that was happening in that particular instance. But also, if you read a few verses down from the Quran, you will also see that when they stop, you must stop, and so on. Now, it is a victory. It's an undeniable victory to the Muslims. 300 versus 1,000, and yet they came out victorious. But despite the victory, it is also a very, very sad day for a lot of Muslims. For example, Abu Hudayfa sees the body of his father, Utbah ibn Rabi'a, and he breaks down and starts crying. And the Prophet ﷺ sees him and goes up to him, and he mournfully tells the Prophet, I had hoped that one day he would become a Muslim, and that hope is now gone. And the Prophet ﷺ holds Abu Hudayfa and comforts him as he cries. You can understand the pain of a son when he sees that. And he said he was living in hope that one day he might be Muslim. The Muslims now gathered together the loot, and they begin to argue who's getting what, who's getting which share. And as they're arguing, Surah Al-Anfal comes down, verse 1, and it instructs them that all the loot, the decision of the loot is up to the Prophet and to Allah. The Sahaba then gather up all the loot and give it to the Prophet ﷺ, and he equally distributes it amongst the Sahaba. Later, in the later few months, the loot itself is divided. Do you know how it's divided? 1/5 goes to the Prophet ﷺ. There is a reason why 1/5 goes to the Prophet ﷺ. Again, a lot of people who dislike Islam say, "Oh, he's a warlord that wants to take loot." No. The Arab tradition was a warlord or a war chieftain would take 1/4 of the war loot, right? 1/4. The Prophet ﷺ reduced it and said 1/5. And the reason is that one of the symbols, or the signifying symbols of being a leader, of a chieftain of a war band or a war group, is that a portion of it goes to you. So symbolically, the Prophet ﷺ is saying, I'll take 1/5 because symbolically that shows everyone that I am the head of this military, the Medinan military. But it wasn't for his personal use, because even of that 1/5, he used a large portion for community. He didn't keep it for himself, most of that. So it wasn't about the money or the loot. It was about making a symbolic statement that the head of this army is the Prophet ﷺ. When the Muslims returned to Medina, there were celebrations. And Surah Al-Anfal verse 26 captures that moment. And they say the celebrations were like it was Eid, right? Except in the families of the martyrs. There was a lot of mourning and crying. And the sad thing is that despite everything that the Prophet ﷺ did, even in his household, there is sadness. And the Prophet himself cannot celebrate. Anyone know why? No. When he returns, his daughter Ruqayya, who was 22 years of age, has passed away. He returns from this amazing battle, this victory that no one could think could happen, to find that his daughter has died. And he and Fatima go to the graveside of Ruqayya and they cry together. So it's really sad. You know how I said throughout the Seerah, I've always said the Prophet ﷺ experienced almost every hardship you can think of. So if you've been in a position where everyone around you is happy and is celebrating and enjoying themselves and you can't, the Prophet's been there. They say it was like Eid, yet he is weeping at the graveside with him and his daughter. The other people are weeping are the families of the martyrs, and Omar, being Omar in true fashion, goes around scolding them, saying, "Why are you crying? They're martyrs. You shouldn't be crying. You should be happy. Stop crying." And the Prophet ﷺ responds with this. He says, "Omar, let them weep. What comes from the heart and from the eye, that is from Allah and His mercy. But what comes from the hand and from the tongue, that is from shaitan." Do you know what that means? Yeah. So it was a tradition that they would beat their chests and rip their clothes and scream. This, the Prophet ﷺ said, is not right. This is from shaitan. But what is from your heart and the tears, this is a mercy from Allah. And that is really beautiful as well, that when we cry out of hardship and when things get too hard for us, that in itself is a mercy from Allah. There's a really nice quote from Tariq Ramadan. He says this: "Always the Prophet's distinctive feature was the combination of strict faithfulness to his principles and human warmth, constantly radiating from his presence. That gentleness and kindness were the very essence of his teaching. He kept saying, God is gentle and he loves gentleness and in everything. The Prophet ﷺ was a person who always balanced strictness in faith with gentleness. I think we covered this a few series ago. He would always instruct or he would warn, but then he would always follow up with something gentle and comforting. And this was an example where he saw people crying and he said, let them cry. This is human nature. Let them be. It was always a balance. And it's so sad because if I had $1 for every time people say that the more religious you get, the more strict you get. I've heard it so many times, I'll probably have about $100, but still, it's a significant amount, which is true. Because unfortunately, I've seen that personally. As people get more religious, they become more strict. But this is not the sunnah of the Prophet. It is hard. He was such a gentle person. He would cry when he sees other people cry. And even the Sahaba, the more they learned about Islam, the softer they became. So it's an unfortunate thing, but it's something we should remember as well. That gentleness was a distinctive feature. It was a sunnah of the Prophet, to be empathetic to other people and to other humans. Now, back in Mecca, we go to Mecca. We covered Medina and how the Muslims are celebrating, and it's like Eid, but in Mecca, things are much, much different. They are ashamed, they're disgusted with themselves, they're now blaming each other. They said, we told you we shouldn't have fought, they're our family, why did we fight? And other people are saying, well, if you had fought better, then this wouldn't have happened. It's in shambles. The Quraysh, the chieftains of the Arabian Peninsula, the people who everyone was scared of, has now just been defeated 15 years after the revelation first came. In 15 years, they've been defeated so badly that they can't face anyone anymore. Abu Sufyan ibn Harith, this is the Prophet's cousin, goes to Abu Lahab and tells the news of what has happened. Now, Abu Lahab had two servants, Fadl and Abu Rafi. These two servants were secret Muslims. And as they are serving Abu Lahab, they hear this and they can't help themselves. They start smiling and they start rejoicing. Abu Lahab sees this, he goes wild, he goes furious. He grabs Abu Rafi and starts beating him, plummeting him. And Fadl tries to intervene, but he can't. And in desperation, Fadl finds a tent pole on the floor, grabs it, and whacks Abu Lahab on the head. That whack makes him unconscious, and a few days later, he passes away. That was the death of Abu Lahab. Again, but in the hands of the Muslims who weren't even in the battle. He was safe at home in Mecca, but he still passes away at the hands of a Muslim. Now, the thing is, at this stage, almost every notable enemy of the Prophet ﷺ has died, except for Abu Sufyan. Abu Sufyan now is the chief of the Quraysh, because there's no one else left. He's made the chief of the Quraysh. And he immediately starts work preparing a new army. Straight away, he gets every money he can. He sends messages out to all the tribes saying, we are going to fight again because we want revenge. We need to regain our honor. And who is supporting him in this? His wife, Hind. Hind. She is worse than Abu Sufyan. She is like, yes. And what does she say? Does anyone know what Hind makes a promise? He said, I will watch Hamza die and I will go and eat his liver. What anger do you have to make a promise that I will resort to cannibalism? And she does. We'll cover that. But don't judge her too harsh as well. We'll get to that afterwards. Now, from the 50/70 Meccans that are captive, slowly the Meccans in Mecca start sending their families with ransoms to ransom them. Some of these Meccans are poor. Their families can't afford the ransom. And what does the Prophet ﷺ say? I will release you if you can teach 10 Medinan children how to read and write. So any Meccan who teaches 10 children to read and write, they are released without any ransom. Amongst the captives, can anyone guess? Abbas, the Prophet ﷺ's uncle, is also captive. And Abbas goes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, come on, you can't, your family, I protected you, you can't take a ransom from me. And the Prophet says, no exception. Either teach 10 kids or pay up. You're not getting any exception. And Abbas says, but what about the fact that I'm so poor? You know I'm poor, I don't have any money. And the Prophet ﷺ says, what about that conversation you had with your wife where you said that if I should die in Badr, how the wealth should be divided amongst the children? And Abbas's mouth drops. She's like, there was no one there. This happened in Mecca, it was between my wife and me. How did you know? And he says, now I declare you are a prophet. Now I believe. It's funny how we see the Sahaba, different Sahaba become Muslim based on different things. Abu Bakr, you say you're a prophet, done. Omar, he hears the Quran and he becomes Muslim. Uthman, he hears a voice. Ali, again, like Abu Bakr, you say it is. Other people, they see the splitting of the moon and become Muslims. But for Abbas, he needed a personal miracle, something personal for him to become a Muslim. And this was the conversation he had with his wife that the Prophet ﷺ was able to tell him. Another person was Walid ibn al-Walid. He becomes a Muslim while in captivity because he sees how the Muslims are treating the prisoners. He doesn't see any miracles or anything, but he sees the nature, not of even the Prophet, of other Muslims and how they're sharing the food and taking care of the prisoners. He becomes a Muslim, but he doesn't tell anyone. He keeps quiet. And when his brothers bring a ransom, they pay him, and on their way back to Medina, Walid runs away from his brothers and comes back to the Muslims and says, I'm a Muslim. And they say, why didn't you say this before? If you said it, we wouldn't have taken a ransom. And he said, that's why. Because I didn't want anyone to think that I became a Muslim so as not to pay the ransom. I became a Muslim from my heart, so the ransom has to be paid. So. The Prophet ﷺ's son-in-law is also captured. He was never a Muslim. This is the husband of Zainab. He is captured and Zainab sends jewelry to the Prophet ﷺ to ransom. The jewelry she sends is her mother's jewelry, Khadija's. And when the Prophet ﷺ sees this jewelry, he breaks down and he cries and cries and cries because he remembers his wife. And he returns the jewelry back to his daughter and he says, I'll release him on the condition that this marriage is finished, it's annulled, and Zainab needs to be sent back to me. Because by this time, revelation has come that a Muslim woman cannot marry a non-Muslim man. And that happens, and Zainab is sent back to the Prophet ﷺ. Should I continue? All right to continue? Everyone not falling asleep? Okay. Few days after Badr, so the Muslims are tired, they're exhausted, they literally have not even cleaned their armor, and news comes, the two Bedouin tribes, the tribe of Ghatafan and the tribe of Sulaim, are preparing to attack and raid Medina because they're thinking this is the best time. They're weak, they're injured, they don't have the strength, we'll raid Medina. The Prophet ﷺ immediately collects a group of soldiers and rides out to these tribes. Remember, the Prophet has just found out that his daughter has died. There's no rest for him. There is no rest. He literally has not cleaned his armor yet, and he rides out. But by this time, the news of what happened at Badr has spread so much that people are so scared that when they ride out to Ghatafan and the tribes, they have scattered. There's not even a battle. They've run away, and they've run away so quickly they left 500 camels. And the Muslims capture the 500 camels and bring them back to Medina. Again, there is no rest for the Prophet ﷺ. When he returns to Medina, there are rumors that Banu Qaynuqa is starting problems. Who's Banu Qaynuqa? The Jewish tribe, one of the Jewish tribes. There were three big Jewish tribes. Anyone name them? Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Qurayza, Banu Nadir. Banu Qurayza and Banu Nadir hold most of the land in Medina, farming land. Banu Qaynuqa weren't farmers, they were traders and merchants. They especially didn't like the Muslims. The reason being is that, remember, the Prophet as soon as he came to Medina, he did two things straight away. The first was build a mosque, the second was start a free market. Banu Qaynuqa were the controllers of the market before. They held all the money, interest. They survived off interest and taxes. When the Prophet ﷺ created a free market, Banu Qaynuqa lost the tax and lost the interest. And this really hurt them and really made them angry. They were hoping the Meccans would do the job for them. They were hoping Badr would get rid of the Muslims. But when that didn't happen, they thought, right, we've got to do something. So they started, there's rumors spreading that they're starting to stir the pot and stir problems, and they're gathering soldiers and gathering weapons. But this is again a key feature of the Prophet ﷺ. He doesn't act on rumors. He never acts on rumors. What he does is he goes and visits Banu Qainuqa. He goes and visits Banu Qainuqa and he tells them, we have honored our pact with you. We have kept you safe. We haven't done any harm to you. Why do you not consider becoming Muslim? And Banu Qainuqa's response is, they say, "O Muhammad, do not deceive yourself. You merely fought a party of the Quraysh who were inexperienced at war. But if you want to fight us, then know that we are an entire people, and indeed you have not met up with anyone like us before." Not only did they scoff at the Prophet's invitation to become Muslim, they literally openly threatened him, saying, "You want to fight? We'll fight." Yet the Prophet didn't do anything. Do never misunderstand and think that the Prophet is someone who acts on rumors or knee-jerk reaction. Still, and the reason he didn't is because he remembers that there is a pact. So I have to be patient. The level of patience the Prophet has is incredible. He's like, there is a pact and I will not act on it. So he remains patiently. Then further news comes from who? Anyone guess who brings the news that Banu Qainuqa is really up to something? Another Jewish person. Abdullah ibn Salam. Abdullah ibn Salam was the chief rabbi of Banu Qainuqa, remember? And he became a Muslim, and the Banu Qainuqa kicked him out. He is like, I have heard personally that they are up to something. You need to do something, Prophet. And at the same time, Surah Al-Anfal verses 58 to 61 is revealed, which pretty much says that if there is a threat to your life, then don't let the pact prevent you from acting. And around the same time, one of the chiefs of Banu Qainuqa news is brought that they have gone to Mecca and is asking the Meccans to come back and fight. So all this evidence is piling up and piling up. He has intelligence. So the Prophet ﷺ has an intelligence service. I told you last week, he's got information. So he knows now beyond any doubt that Banu Qainuqa is about to break the pact. And of course the revelation comes, there's no more to be said. But he still doesn't act. He gathers the Sahaba, he starts preparing, but he doesn't do anything. Why? Because Banu Qainuqa hasn't done anything. He doesn't retaliate based on just rumors or intention. He will only break the pact if the other side breaks the pact. And that was the Prophet ﷺ's principle. What happens then is something did happen for the pact to break. In the marketplace, a Muslim woman is assaulted and abused by a tribesman of the Banu Qainuqa. One of the Ansar comes to her defense. There is an argument, backwards and fighting, becomes physical. The Banu Qainuqa Jewish person is killed, and the Jews in the marketplace kill the Ansar. So now, big problem. 2 people have died. The Sahaba say, according to the written conditions of the pact, the Prophet ﷺ is to arbitrate, right? He is to make a decision in this situation. Banu Qainuqa breaks that condition and says, we will not accept the Prophet's arbitration. That breaks the pact. That was what the Prophet ﷺ had to wait for, because he didn't want to be the one breaking the pact. But Banu Qainuqa breaks the pact. Not only do they do that, they fortify their fortress. They pretty much lived in a kind of a fortress. They fortify it, they gather soldiers, they gather arms. Now there's no turning back. The Prophet ﷺ gathers a brigade of Muslims, and he goes and besieges where Banu Qainuqa is living. And Hamza is with him at the time, and they besiege the area. But Banu Qainuqa sends a message to the 2 Khazraj chiefs, Abdullah ibn Ubay and Ubadah ibn Samit. Abdullah ibn Ubay, does that ring a bell? Abdullah ibn Ubay. Ibn Ubay Salu? Have I got it mistaken? He was it wasn't a Sahaba. He was the person who was going to be made king. The hypocrite, Abdullah ibn Ubay. So he sends a message to both these chiefs of Khazraj saying, remember your pact with us? We used to have a pact before Muhammad came. You need to help us now. Come help us because they're besieging us. Abdullah ibn Ubay says, we should help the Jews, because remember he was very jealous of the Prophet ﷺ. He was a hypocrite. He said, yeah, we should help. But luckily Ubadah ibn Samit says, no, we are Muslims now. We have a pact with the Prophet. We are not going to break it. They broke their pact. That's on them. Abdullah ibn Ubay is so angered by this, that he actually dares to grab the Prophet by the collar and starts shaking him, saying, "Stop the siege." And yet, the Prophet doesn't retaliate on him. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that he grabs the Prophet and shakes him, and yet the Prophet does not do anything to him? No ego at all. See, the Prophet ﷺ, the only time he gets angry is if injustice is done to the deen or to another innocent person, never to himself. But so the Muslims do not come to the help of the Banu Quraysh, and what happens is the siege ends because they have to, they can't survive anymore, and the Prophet ﷺ calls them and says, "You are exiled." Interesting thing is, according to Arab custom and law, and according to Jewish custom and law, the punishment for breaking a pact is not exile, it is death. Everyone is shocked that the Prophet ﷺ chooses not to kill them, but exiles them. Not only does he exile them, he actually allows them to carry some of their property with them. And later Banu Qaynuqa goes and sets up near the border of Syria. Near Syria, on the border of Syria. Another question that comes is, why didn't the other Jewish tribes help them? The other Jewish tribes didn't intervene, they stayed neutral when this was happening. The reason is because according to Jewish law, it was very clear that Banu Qaynuqa was the one that broke the pact. They were breaking the pact not only by reaching out to the Quraysh and making treaties with them, but also by not sticking to the conditions. So the other Jewish tribes couldn't justify helping this tribe, because then they would be breaking Jewish law. So we'll stop there, inshallah, and we'll continue next week. Thank you, everyone.